So, welcome everybody to this first ever English version of Migrationssnack, or migration chats, as we've called it in English. For those of you who are new, Migration Chats is a forum where we try to promote a more sort of informed discussion on migration and border issues through providing shorter video interviews with academics and experts on migration in order to put current migration affairs into context and provide background, etc. And my name is Anja Frank. I'm an associate professor in peace and development studies at the School of Global Studies in the University of Gothenburg, and I work on migration-related issues. And today we have two people here. The first is Joseph Anderson, or Joe, as we call you, who actually runs this forum together with me, but has not showed his face on the screen yet. So, hello, Joe.
Hello.
Welcome to the other side of the screen. Joe, you are a migration researcher at the School of Global Studies, also the same place that I work in the University of Gothenburg. And we are very happy and proud that we have Saskia Bonjour with us today. Hello, Saskia. Welcome to Migration Chats. You are an associate professor in political science, right? In the University of Amsterdam. And the reason that we have asked you here today is that you are an expert on migration and integration issues in the European context. And about 2 weeks ago, a parliamentary committee in Sweden presented their proposal for a long-term and sustainable migration policy in Sweden. And this proposal, it contains several aspects that we in academic talk would call civic integration measures, or medborgerliga integrationskrav in Swedish. And this means that Sweden now wants to connect different civic and social demands to the possibility of getting permanent residency. In Swedish, that means att man vill koppla ett antal integrationskrav till möjligheten att få permanent uppehållstillstånd. And Joe, you have read this proposal, and what kind of civic integration demands do we see in this proposal?
So the first thing is the continuation of the försörjningskrav, which is already a rule for people who come to Sweden seeking protection, that in order to get a permanent residency permit, they need to show that they can financially support themselves, get a job, basically, or start a business. So this would sort of enshrine that permanently and sort of for all individuals who want to get permanent residency. The second thing is the introduction of some sort of language test or language requirement. It's not clear if it would be a test or a class. And then the third thing is some sort of what we could call kind of social studies, Swedish society course or program that anybody wanting to get permanent residency would have to complete. And then the final thing is sort of some sort of behaving in a way that meets with Swedish values, which seems to be a requirement of not having committed certain crimes or sort of certain waiting periods after having committed or being found guilty of committing certain crimes. Some sort of system in which those behaviors would be taken into consideration.
Yeah. So one of the questions that we had for you, Saskia, that we wanted help with sort of navigating is how common these types of policies are. Like, what is it, how common is it that countries use these types of demands as a prerequisite for permanent residency or citizenship?
Yeah, so the financial independence bit and the, let's say, public order bit, so not having committed a crime, those are classics. They've been part of migration control policies for as long as migration control policies have existed. And also for citizenship, for sure. So to naturalize, you would have to show in many different countries that you are able to support yourself without state assistance, and also that you're a law-abiding soon-to-be citizen. So those are classics. And it's also not uncommon to have these kinds of conditions also for access to permanent residence. So the relatively new thing is to have the language and knowledge of society conditions there. That's really what civic integration has. The civic integration turn is what scholars call it. So since let's say since the mid 2000s, especially in Western Europe, many countries have introduced these kinds of language courses or tests, and also so host society courses and tests. And it was not uncommon to have these kind of requirements for naturalization, so for accessing citizenship, but then it was often in a kind of informal way where you would have to meet with a civil servant and talk to them in Swedish, and then the civil servant would determine whether you were integrated enough to become a Swedish citizen. I don't know whether this existed in Sweden in this way, but it existed in many European countries in this way. And so what the civic integration turn does is it does two things. First thing is it formalizes it into a test that is the same for everybody, or a course, that depends. And then the second thing is that it brings it forward. So it's not just for accessing citizenship, it's already for accessing permanent residence. Mm-hmm. And in some countries, it's even for first entry. So you already have to pass a course, pass a test before you even get a visa.
Mm-hmm.
And why do you think this sort of has become more popular with countries to sort of use these measures at sort of both more of them and sort of at earlier stages in the process?
So it's politically, it's very much part of the backlash against multiculturalism in Europe. So multiculturalism actually hasn't existed in that many European countries, but there's many countries which have said, we don't want multiculturalism anymore. Like Merkel said that when really Germany never had multicultural policies, and Sarkozy said that when France never had multicultural policies. But there was this political trend in Europe in the 2000s to say that instead of celebrating cultural differences, there had to be an emphasis on social cohesion. And then the idea that social cohesion requires shared values, shared norms, and shared cultural behaviors. And so civic integration is really about that. It's about telling the story and implementing policies to make migrants more fit better in European societies. And then the big question is, the big question also for scholars is whether, like, there's at least three possible purposes. The one thing is to empower or enable migrants to live better lives in European societies. The second thing is to keep those migrants out, to stop those migrants from coming or from staying who can't fit. And the third thing is to symbolically show, like for electoral purposes, for symbolic purposes, that the states of Europe are intervening to keep the identities of European societies intact.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, and this all these three, I think, have been part of the Swedish debate. We can identify all three of these. Perhaps particularly the latest, the last one you mentioned, where there has been some discussion, public discussion in Sweden, particularly on the language test, where critical language scholars have said that these are not actually having requirements in this way does not necessarily promote a better knowledge of Swedish, but or a better sort of pathway to becoming part of the society, but it actually connects. Making a test makes demands on immigrants rather than helping them, sort of, which I think is a classic sort of argument in civic integration research, right? This
Yes.
balance between, yeah.
Exactly, between requirements and support. So there's major differences in that in different countries also. So for when you follow what the Swedish government is going to do now, major questions are, so there's probably going to be an obligation, it sounds like it, but will it be an obligation to participate in a course, or will it be a requirement to pass a test? So is it about making an effort? Is it an obligation to make an effort, or is it an obligation to reach a certain level? Those are very different policy instruments. And also major question, what kind of support will there be for newcomers to find the appropriate course that fits their particular situation? What will the quality of the courses be, and who will pay for the courses? Will there be assistance for people so that they can, it takes time to participate in these courses and to study, and in that time you can't take care of your kids and you also can't work. So like you need to pay for people's time to enable them to actually participate in these courses. And that's something that in the Netherlands, for instance, has been severely lacking, that kind of actual support to enable people to make the most out of such courses.
And I guess the question that we really want to ask, because it's quite new to the Swedish context, is, does it work? I mean, what do we know about this from countries that have done this before?
Yeah, so there's one study that I find particularly interesting that colleagues from the US have done. They compared 15 European countries, 12 of which have introduced different degrees of civic integration courses. And they looked at how migrants, people who migrated less than 10 years ago, how they were doing. And they conclude that it has a small but significant positive effect on political integration. So on whether newcomers have an interest in the politics of their host country, whether they understand those politics, and whether they can make decisions about which parties to favor, for instance. So it has a positive effect on that, but it has no significant positive effect that they could identify on economic integration, so on whether people are employed and how they themselves assess their economic well-being. And it has no positive effect also on social relations or on social integration or on trust. So very little, very, very little integration impact that they could identify. And the same I followed the evaluations of Dutch policies most closely, and there it's really very clear. But the Dutch program in particular, like many other programs in the UK, for instance, but it was really also this individual responsibility thing where people actually had to pay for their own courses, and it was an open market, the language courses, so they had to identify their own courses. And that didn't work at all, because quite obviously when you just arrive in a country, it's very difficult to figure out what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to do it and where the courses are, and you don't have money. So that hasn't worked at all. And I think so the especially with respect to language courses, which can be useful, right? It can be very useful to receive support to learn the language of your new country, but then that has got to be support, and not a selection mechanism.
And that's the key, right?
These policies. Yes, because in practice, what these policies seem to do is work as gatekeeping mechanisms. They keep certain people out, or they keep certain people in extended precariousness. And then, I mean, we all know, migration scholars know, but also social scientists in general know that insecurity is bad for people's well-being, and it's also bad for people's autonomy and participation and all these things that we relate to migrant integration. So when people don't have a secure residence status and don't feel safe in their being allowed to stay, that doesn't help their integration at all. And in many cases, civic integration requirements just prolong precariousness.
So a potential way forward then would be to make support mechanisms rather than testing mechanisms. Is that what the research would be telling us?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And then that has to be part of a broader societal context where people get access to labor markets, get access to different forms of social engagement and exchange that it's partially for the state to organize and partially for a society to do. But social integration happens through work and friends and neighborhood relationships, right? So it doesn't happen just with one course.
Thank you so much. Joe, do you have another question or?
No, I mean, in a lot of ways, it just sort of makes sense when you have integration policies that are designed to help people integrate and make that a process, then that works. If you create things that are designed to punish people, if you gatekeepers, obviously that's going to exclude certain people. It's sort of the.
Because there is this interesting mix here, right? This is what civic integration does, is to mix the area of integration with border control, right? To put in control mechanisms of who gets to be on the inside and who gets to be on the outside. And that's what makes this field so interesting, I think.
Yeah.
It is, yes. And it's also what makes it, like, in the Swedish case, the civic requirements are for permanent residents, but in practice, nobody gets expulsed. So actually nobody has to leave the country because they don't pass the test. I mean, that's just practically and legally very complicated once people are in the country. But what does happen is that they continually have to prolong their temporary status because they never manage to get access to the permanent residency, which is just bad. It harms their life conditions and their well-being. So it doesn't do much good if it's set up that way. No.
But thank you so much for this. This was super interesting. And I am sure we will ask to get back to you once we see what the final proposal is. Because now this in Sweden, it goes out on a remissrunda, we call it, where different actors get to have input and so on. So even if this time it will go quite quickly because they need something new in place, but still we will see what the end product is. But thank you so much for helping us navigate this, and good luck.
Thanks for having me.
Work. Yeah. Bye.